Start with some housekeeping before we begin. My name is Chris Bayliss. I'm Director of Standards with the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. Delighted to be hosting this 45 minutes on, one in a regular series of 45 minutes on. We'll talk a bit about the subject matter, introduce my guest in a moment. But before then, just a quick note that Q&A box is always available throughout these 45 minutes on, and we really do welcome your questions. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom. Any questions that are asked, we'll try to answer those during the session. And if not, then we'll try and answer them after the session. There is a chat box. Try not to use the chat box, please. Q&A helps us to manage those questions much more easily from my side. So thanks very much. So without further ado, let's go straight into today's 45 minutes on is focused on circularity. Driving circularity is one of the 4 strategic priorities for ASI over the next 3 to 5 years, along with climate change mitigation, human rights due diligence, and driving nature positive solutions. And while some of those issues are more easily defined, circularity can be quite broad, lots of different things to different people. So I'm delighted today to welcome Dr. Shyaam Ramkumar to talk to us today about circularity broadly, and then specifically about his research. Recently completed a PhD from the University of Milan on business relationships as a driver for circularity. So how do we use some of these interactions between actors within the sector to drive us towards circularity? I hope we'll have lots of discussion today, not just on the theory, but also that practical application to the aluminium sector writ large and the ASI in particular. The way we're going to work today is Shyam's going to give us an introduction to circularity, and I think that's a good opportunity for you, the audience, to ask any questions broadly on themes of circularity, and then we're going to dive into Shyam's research in particular. One thing to note before we begin, many of you may know our material flow that shows chain of custody material mapped onto the global aluminium flow. Dr. Ramkumar was actually one of the team that developed that initial regionalized material flow model for the aluminium sector. So a renowned expert joining us today. So with that, welcome, Shyaam. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
What I'm going to do is I'm just going to hand over to you to introduce to circularity, and then we'll have a chat.
Perfect. Yeah, sounds great. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining. Let me just share my screen here. And let me know if you all can see the screen now.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Yeah, just starting off with a very quick introduction about myself. So I have a background in economics and statistics from Northwestern University in the United States, and I worked in the US for a few years as a consultant at Accenture in their sustainability team, before I moved to Norway to do a master's in industrial ecology, where, as Chris mentioned, I was involved in the research team that built the MFA model for the aluminium sector. I was working on that regional material flow analysis. Once I was finished with my master's, I went to Circle Economy in the Netherlands, where I worked as a knowledge and innovation manager for about 4 years. And I got really interested in the idea of how do you sort of spread and diffuse circular innovations, ideas, etc., and started a PhD in a field called economic sociology at the University of Milan, which, yeah, indeed, I recently completed about 3 weeks ago. I was awarded the PhD. And in my time in Italy, I was also involved in a few organizations to kind of promote circular economy, circular innovation, etc. So excited to share more about the topic of the circular economy, and also my research as well, and how I see how it can be practically applied to help organizations promote and spread circular economy thinking. So very quickly with the circular economy, let's see here. Oh, perfect. So yeah, today's economy can be thought of as linear. The way that our current production and consumption systems are designed, they're largely operating in a sort of take, make, waste mentality. So essentially, they're designed to almost extract resources, process them to make different products, and or consume those products in society. And once we're done, essentially kind of throw them away. And there's some elements of recycling to extract a lot of those resources, but a lot of the global economy is operating in a fairly linear system. And some reports by Circular Economy have found that the global economy is only around 8.6% circular. So a large part of the resources are lost and not cycled back into the global economy. And this has significant impacts. There's a nice kind of view by the Donut Economics Lab that looks at the Stockholm Resilience Center's planetary boundaries and combines it with the social aspects of our current global economy. And you can see that there's sort of an ecological ceiling and a social foundational floor where we want to be in that sweet spot, that almost donut in green. And there's a significant sort of shortfall in terms of a lot of the social aspects, and also an overshoot in a lot of the environmental and ecological aspects. So issues like climate change, biodiversity loss, the loading of nitrogen and phosphorus into the environment, pollution, et cetera. And then issues related to food, water security, health, education, social equity. All these kind of issues are almost a result of the way we've kind of designed our global economy since the Industrial Revolution. I think it's largely remained the same and kind of expanded exponentially since then. So continuing in this manner is really unsustainable and requires fundamental transformations in the way that we can operate as an economy, as a society. And the circular economy as a concept has been quickly gaining momentum. Even a few years ago, it was a topic that was kind of emerging, particularly in Europe and in the United States, et cetera. And now in Europe specifically, it's become a sort of established vision for how Europe wants to transform its economy to the future. And the US is very much looking into it as well, as are a lot of economies around the world. And the sort of idea with the circular economy is one that focuses on moving away from that take, make, waste kind of system into an economy that's focused on loops. And it really tries to incorporate a way to sort of regenerate the economy and design out waste and pollution by keeping materials in circulation for as much as possible, for as long as possible. And really all these loops are trying to focus as well on making sure we prioritize inner loops. So how do we maintain products for as long as possible, reuse them, refurbish them before we go to the final step of recycling? And it's applicable not only for more technical products, things like laptops, computers, other kinds of devices that we use, et cetera, but also biological products as well. So thinking about the nutrients that we utilize to create different chemicals, different kinds of biological products. How do we make sure that we keep those in circulation and extract as much value before kind of losing them to energy recovery or landfill? And I'll show you a very quick video that does a nice job of explaining the sort of linear economy and the circular economy and the differences between the two. And then we'll pause a bit for some questions to just see if anyone has any questions about the concept in general.
The example of nature, where nothing is wasted and everything reused, forms the inspiration.
Not sure what happened there.
For the concept of circular economy. Let's look at what it consists of. Traditionally, the production and consumption system worked in a linear way. Products designed to be used, consumed, and thrown out after a single life cycle. But this model could now be reaching its end, its place taken by the circular economy, a system of using resources where reduction, reuse, and recycling of elements is valued most, and waste is turned back into resources. The linear model depends on the extraction of resources, their conversion into materials, and their assembly, resulting in a product or service soon to become waste. All its stages imply intensive energy use and consumption of resources, and the emission of gases which pollute. On the other hand, the circular economy seeks to use resources in all stages of the life cycle of the product or service. It evaluates the environmental impact from the design stage to the acquisition of raw materials, in manufacturing and transport, and end use. The resources used can be reused during its different stages, or to create new products, always with the idea of increasing the lifetime of the products. The circular economy is not limited to consumer goods, but also present in other types of services, such as waste-to-energy technology, which uses residues from farming and forest production to generate sustainable energy, such as in biomass plants, where the circular economy meets renewable energy. Another example of the use of resources might be the employment of grass or other surplus vegetation as a fertilizer in the gardening sector. As you see, the circular economy, imitating nature where nothing is wasted, helps to reduce the consumption of resources, increase the life of products and services, and reduce waste generation.
So hopefully that gave a very nice overview of the difference between the current kind of linear system and the idea or concept of the circular economy. And yeah, maybe Chris, I guess we can stop there and
Sure thing.
From the audience.
We've got a couple of questions coming through. I've got a couple of questions as well, Shyaam.
Okay.
So the first one's come in is how is circularity different from industrial ecology? Is there a difference in there? What's that?
Yeah, the concept actually has a lot of foundational theories and ideas behind it. When industrial ecology indeed is one of the core tenets of it. And yeah, it essentially tries to bring together elements of design thinking, elements of industrial ecology and material flows, elements of new business models and product and service systems, et cetera. So it tries to kind of combine all of these different schools of thought into a concept that allows different options and strategies for companies, for organizations, for society in general, to almost think about how to change the way we operate, produce and consume resources, engage and collaborate with each other, et cetera. So yeah, a lot of the circular economy work, they are sort of looking for people with a background in industrial ecology as a starting point to understand what do those material flows look like, what are the sort of levers where we can transform the current system, and where are the opportunities to kind of create some of those closed loops.
Well, it's going to be interesting actually when you present your research in a moment, as well as those sociological aspects, because that industrial ecology and I guess sometimes the discussion on circularity is often about the deployment of technology. There's kind of hard technological deployments, whereas really the relationships between the different parts in the chain maybe can potentially have a more material impact than deployment of individual technologies.
Yeah, indeed, definitely.
There's a question come in, and I'm going to add on to it as well, and we can maybe see where this goes. It's you mentioned this 8% today of global economy being circular. The question is, which sectors are most circular today? Maybe is it in the technical materials or in the biological materials? And also for that 8%, how is that measured? Are there tools out there to kind of measure circularity?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, indeed, the circular economy has done this piece of work over the past 3 years to measure the global circularity of the global economy. It's called the Circularity Gap Report, and I can share the resources maybe after the webinar as well if anyone's interested in reading through those reports. And essentially what they've done is try to do a global material flow analysis to understand, given the use of resources around the world in different sectors for different societal uses. Oh yeah, exactly. That's the link to the report there, the report series. And yeah, so they've kind of understood or tried to understand essentially what is that level of circularity? How much resources do we cycle back into our production systems, and given kind of current rates of recycling, et cetera. And they started to do it as well for different regions and also different sectors, et cetera. And there's some work I'm collaborating with them on at the moment to research different sectors. And yeah, I think we're finding that indeed certain sectors are better than others. Looking at the built environment, for example, and the construction sector, I think that is above average in terms of circularity when it comes to the global economy. Automotive as well, I think
Why?
is really
long product lifetimes. What's the reason? We've got the next question is from the building industry. So actually, I'm going to come to that in a moment.
Right. No, exactly. With the built environment, indeed, there's long product lifetimes, and right now, actually, with a lot of the circularity, it is circular indeed, but a lot of the construction and demolition waste is largely downcycled, which is a bit of a shame. But given a lot of the building stock that is becoming available in the next, decade, 2 decades in the future, there's a huge opportunity for the built environment sector to become even more circular by transforming how they kind of demolish buildings and separate the wastes and are able to reuse it. And there's some great kind of initiatives by some Dutch construction companies and others that are trying to see how they can establish almost like material banks. How do we understand buildings as like a source or a mine for materials, so that instead of going and extracting resources from the sort of traditional areas, we look at buildings as an opportunity to extract those resources and reuse them. So there's some really interesting developments there. I think off the top of my head, I guess I don't know which sectors exactly are more circular than others, but I think in those reports, indeed, there's a breakdown of the different sectors.
Is it useful to do that? I mean, the video talks about this kind of nature, this kind of natural systems, but nature isn't a singular flow. It's many flows nested in one bigger flow. We could talk about European circularity, global circularity. Is it useful to pick those different pieces apart, or rather to look at it systematically? But then you get kind of lost in the numbers, didn't you?
Right. Yeah, it's a bit of a balancing act to see how far up you want to go in terms of that bird's eye view, but then in terms of identifying those opportunities and making those changes, you sort of have to drill down to understand on the ground, if you want to implement a change or take advantage of a circular economy opportunity, how do you exactly do that? In which industry, in which geography, what are the kind of partners and stakeholders do you work with in order to actually make that happen? So yeah, I think it's sort of a two-pronged approach in terms of having that overview to understand, well, are we making any progress? And with Circular Economy's reports, the sort of consensus is that there's not been much progress made. I think in the first report, it was 8.1% circular, and then it increased a bit a few years later, and then it decreased again. So it's a bit of a sort of steady level that we are staying at. It's not an incremental.
I'm surprised they're doing it to one decimal place. I'll be honest. That's quite a.
Right.
That's.
But yeah, it just shows that there's a huge opportunity to kind of understand how do we go from 8% to 20 or 40 in the future.
So there's a very specific question, I guess, on measurement of that, and it comes from the Council for Aluminium in Buildings, is how does one perform the environmental assessments? Is it environmental product declaration? Is it something else? What kind of tools would one use to do that?
Yeah, so a lot of the analysis to understand kind of circularity focuses on material flow analysis for the most part. And there's actually a great resource by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They have developed, in partnership with a few other organizations, the circularity transition indicators. And it really helps organizations understand, within the boundary of their operations or their supply chain, how do you measure circularity? And it really looks at what are the inputs that you have into the system that are from recycled, renewable kind of sources, and what are the outputs coming out of the system, and how much of those outputs are recycled or reused, refurbished, etc., instead of landfilled or disposed. And so that kind of gives an understanding of the circularity of the system, essentially. So that's one part of it. And then to understand sort of what are the impacts of those changes on emissions and other kind of environmental metrics. There's a lot of life cycle analysis that's employed as well, combined with that material flow analysis to understand, what are also the emissions consequences of the material flows, and how do you kind of make changes so that not only materials are saved and resources are preserved, but also we don't do it in a way that causes more emissions or more environmental damage.
while coping with a growing global population with increasing needs.
Right, a lot of different variables to account for. Indeed.
Brilliant. Thanks for the introduction. I think we've got to get into your research now, because there's lots of questions come in. Feel free to ask more questions, and we can always ask Dr. Ramkumar afterwards as well. But maybe we'll go. I'm going to let you present your research, and then we're going to come back for some more Q&A as well, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, that sounds great. No problem.
Brilliant.
Great. I'll just reshare my screen here. Great. Yeah. So thank you for the questions. Indeed, it's interesting to see how we can kind of implement the circular economy now that we know what the concept is at a kind of abstract level. What does it really take to get to that? And well, there's been a lot of work to show that innovation is really important to the circular economy. So Chris, you mentioned it as well. There's a big sort of technology focus to see how we could create the right kind of technologies, the right kind of processes and methods, et cetera, to actually create some of these closed loops to see how we can save resources, save energy, and cycle things back. And there's a great report by Utrecht University talking about how circular startups and entrepreneurs, innovators, et cetera, can accelerate that circular economy transition. And that's something that we see in the market as well. The sort of number of environmental sustainable startups that have been funded over the past decade or so has been exponentially increasing, which is great, just to sort of provide that foundation for different solutions, different options for how we achieve the circular economy. And it's important also to know that technology is, of course, important, but ultimately technology needs to be adopted by society. So there's actually a lot of sociological factors that are can present drivers and barriers to the adoption of the circular economy. And there's sort of a report that looked at the different kinds of barriers, cultural, technological, market, regulatory, and sort of tried to understand which ones are the most pressing and least pressing. And, surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, the cultural and sociological barriers are the most pressing. So consumer interest and awareness, culture, looking at, the willingness to collaborate, those are the kinds of factors that have present the most obstacles to the circular economy. And of course, there's technological and market and regulatory barriers as well. But from this report, it was kind of shown that some of the sociological factors are quite important to tackle if we want to transition to a more circular economy. And so, yeah, there's also been research looking at, how this comes into play when you look at that from a systemic perspective. There's a great report by Laurenti et al. That looked at the socioeconomic embeddedness of the circular economy. So, we think about material flows and resource use, et cetera, but behind all that, or perhaps on top of all that, there's a sort of network of different actors, manufacturers, producers, retailers, consumers, recyclers, et cetera, that are all linked to each other in different ways in a sort of network. And the relationships that they have with each other, the kind of interactions they have, et cetera, almost dictate how materials are used in society, and to what extent we can kind of modify that system in order to create some of those closed loops and implement a circular economy. And so this is what I got really interested in with my PhD research, trying to understand these networks, these relationships, and how does that, the sort of behaviors that result from that affect the adoption of circular economy innovations and the implementation of circular economy thinking. So indeed, with my PhD, it was sort of a focus on two specific papers that formed the basis or the foundation of my PhD. One was to understand how networks and relationships on the circular economy affected the adoption of innovations, and another to look at sort of how, are there specific companies that you want to target or focus on or get on board with a particular innovation or a particular idea in order to spread circular economy thinking faster through the network. And I'll go into both of these research streams of my PhD in the next couple of minutes. So yeah, with the first kind of stream, I really looked at a case study of Jaguar Land Rover and their real car project. It was a really fascinating kind of innovation where they partnered with Novelis, their supplier, to implement a closed loop production process for the manufacturing of vehicles. And they sort of created an alloy that allowed waste scrap to be collected and put back into the vehicle production process. And then they sort of had to go out and get different suppliers in their supply chain to basically put in place the different processes and systems to collect this waste, make sure it's not contaminated, and then transport it for recycling. So I was really interested in understanding how the relationships and dynamics between these different actors resulted in the adoption of this kind of system and the adoption of this kind of closed loop recycling innovation. So yeah, there was the research involved sort of interviews with stakeholders from Jaguar Land Rover, from Novelis, and from the different stamping facilities, both owned by JLR and external as well as scrap dealers, to just try to understand what are some of the motivating factors for why they decided to adopt this technology, what were some of the pitfalls, et cetera. And it was, yeah, the findings were quite interesting. So there was a big focus on the influence of Jaguar Land Rover as a customer. So their kind of position in the network as a customer, the kind of importance that they played in terms of dictating how their suppliers acted, et cetera, was one of the big reasons. And many of the mentions in the interview were focusing on how, in the grand scheme of things for suppliers, putting in place processes to collect scrap was a sort of small investment to keep the business of Jaguar Land Rover and potentially strengthen that relationship with them into the future. It was sort of a small price to pay and opened opportunities for future business, et cetera. So that was kind of quite interesting to see how that dynamic between buyer seller, sort of OEM and supplier, kind of really affected how the innovation was implemented. And what was more importantly, was more interesting was the role of the scrap dealer. So essentially, before the closed loop innovation was implemented, scrap dealers would essentially take the waste material from these different facilities, sell it on the open market, and that's how they would profit. And then with this new innovation, their role actually got relegated to more transporters. So they essentially were responsible for taking the scrap metal and transporting it for recycling. So they were most affected by this push to create this closed loop system. And as a result, many of them actually tried to delay the implementation of real car. So there were some interesting, dynamics where scrap dealers would try to kind of pay in advance for the scrap so that the stamping facilities wouldn't be able to send it back for recycling, or they would sort of pay more for scrap, et cetera. And so they tried to almost like delay the implementation of this process. But ultimately, for many of the facilities, it was almost a decision of, do we keep our business with Jaguar Land Rover, an important customer, or do we kind of take the short-term benefit in working with our scrap dealers? And there were also many scrap dealers that ultimately, decided to get on board. A lot of the larger ones saw that this was the only way that they could operate within this network. So ultimately got on board with the innovation. But it was, really interesting to see how the kind of social dynamics and the relationships between actors in the supply chain can really affect how quickly or slowly innovations related to the circular economy, related to closed loop recycling, et cetera, can be implemented. And that was the sort of big conclusion that, there's, of course, technical and financial considerations for innovations, but the social processes and the relationships that actors in a supply chain have with each other is also a big component of whether particular innovations can be adopted and how quickly they get adopted by the network of actors. And then, yeah, the second piece of the research really looked at innovation diffusion. So it tried to understand, what are the motivating factors for firms to adopt a particular innovation, and how does that look when you look at sort of networks of firms or wider kind of systems. And research has shown that for individual actors, for individual firms, there's really sort of two classes of factors that determine whether an innovation is adopted or not. So there's internal factors related to the size of the firm, the business benefits of the innovation, the capacity of the firm to integrate this technology, culture and leadership, et cetera. But there's also external factors like regulations, market demand, stakeholder pressures, the sort of industry trends. And another kind of factor that was less often studied was the sort of relationships with other firms. So how do companies even actually become aware of these new innovations? How do they learn about it? How do they kind of look for signals from people that they work with or partner with to see whether something is worth implementing? And so that's what I really focused on. And the reason for that is because there was a sort of another stream of research that showed that the adoption and diffusion of new technologies, new ideas can really depend on the structure of the network and how players are connected to each other. Firms are connected to each other, stakeholders are connected to each other. And so there are certain kind of key actors, and they're the ones in blue here, that are positioned in a certain way in the network and have certain connections where if you manage to sort of get them on board first, you have this faster spread of the idea through the network. People become more aware of it, and so the adoption rates can increase. So I was really interested in sort of combining these two streams of research to understand, you know, if we want to kind of spread eco innovations and environmental innovations and circular innovations faster, how do we identify these kind of key players, these key actors, given the kind of network dynamics and given the sort of adoption dynamics that I presented earlier? And so a large part of my research was to develop a sort of simulation model that tried to create and simulate a network of relationships. Different companies are connected to each other. Some were strongly connected, some were more weakly connected to each other, et cetera. And they were connected in different kind of network structures. So a random network, a hub and spoke kind of network, just to imitate different industrial networks, supply chain networks, et cetera. And the research really looked at what are some strategies that can be employed to approach these different companies to see how quickly a certain idea, a certain innovation, et cetera, would spread. So some of the strategies were, well, you can go after the person with the most connections. So does that yield higher adoption rates? Or do you go after firms or actors with the most influence? So maybe not the most connections, but the strongest connections to others. What if you go after sort of neighbors of companies or organizations that have already adopted the innovation? And then there's some strategies there. And all of this was just to understand what, is there a sort of, the hypothesis, is there a way to kind of focus on specific nodes or specific organizations or firms in a network, specific stakeholders, where if you sort of target them and focus your efforts on getting them on board with an idea, that idea has a much better chance of spreading through the network, a higher success rate, and faster adoption rates. And so what was interesting was the research found that there's different strategies that work in different situations. So essentially for incremental innovations, ones that don't take a lot of time or investment, are very sort of easy to spread, very easy to see the benefits, et cetera, it makes a lot of sense to target companies that have a lot of connections or a lot of influence. So it's almost a no-brainer that if you approach somebody and the idea just makes sense to implement, they'll do it. So you want to go after the companies that can then spread the idea the fastest after that. But when it comes to more sort of radical innovations, and a lot of circular economy or environmental innovations can be considered fairly radical, fairly transformative. For that, it requires a different strategy. And in this case, rather than going after companies with the most connections, because you never know whether they'd be willing to adopt it or not. And it would be a bad situation if you sort of approach a company with a lot of connections and they kind of shut down the decision to adopt it. And so you kind of close a lot of doors that way. So in that kind of situation, what was more beneficial, or what the kind of optimal strategy in that case is actually to go after neighbors of adopters, looking at people who have already adopted, seeing who are they sort of closely connected to, specifically like the most influential neighbors, see who they're closely connected to, have strong relationships with, and then approach them to adopt, and sort of slowly grow the network of adopters that way. And that actually yielded the fastest and highest rates of adoption in diffusion through the network. So yeah, the kind of research really showed that certain stakeholders, certain organizations in a network are sort of more important than others when it comes to seeing how quickly a certain idea, a certain technology, a process, et cetera, can spread through that network. And really understanding the networks of relationships, understanding how they're connected to each other, and then identifying these actors through this kind of analysis can really help innovations spread faster, diffuse faster through the networks, and have a higher chance of being successfully implemented. And yeah, the last part before we get into the questions here, wanted to share that right now I'm sort of seeing how to apply this research to help companies use this kind of network thinking to really accelerate the development of circular economy innovations, scale these initiatives, et cetera. So in the process of developing this tool now, and it really kind of does some of the stuff that I showed you with my research, tries to map the networks and relationships between companies and employ a simulation model to identify how do we prioritize the companies, how do we identify which companies are the ones that can accelerate and increase the rates of adoption and successful implementation. And it really tries to take sort of a list of companies and rank them in terms of these are the companies that you want to really prioritize or focus your efforts on in order to get higher rates of adoption and success through the network. And also here are some existing relationships that you have, and here's how you can leverage those existing relationships to reach these high value sort of prospects. So really want to see how to utilize this research to give some practical insights for organizations to help them understand who are the right stakeholders, who are the right partners they should focus on, and how they can leverage the kind of existing relationships and networks that they have in order to accelerate the diffusion of sustainable circular economy ideas. So I'll close there and open it up for questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Shyaam. Excellent. I've got some questions, and we can see some rolling in as well. I'm going to start with mine, and that's that. You know, this I guess what you've shown here is about how that giving of innovations to, let's say, actors to enable adoption is one strategy. But I guess, can the same be applied to companies which want to change how they adopt innovations? So the receivers of innovation, is there something in your research that can actually tell companies how they can maximize their openness to innovation, not just the selling of innovation into the networks?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So indeed, I think, from looking at a network perspective, is also important for companies to understand how they can access information as well. So in the field of economic sociology, in that kind of research stream, there's a lot of discussions of strong and weak ties. And really that, when you're really well connected to a certain set of firms and you're within that network, everybody almost knows the same thing. So you're just kind of sharing the same pieces of information that goes around. And there's this idea of weak ties. So, some of the more innovative ideas, the sort of awareness of ideas comes from this one-off kind of connection where you might meet somebody on an airplane or have a drink at a hotel bar, and that's how this sort of idea comes to you. So I think for companies and organizations, it's important to understand the limitations of operating within that fixed network of players and seeing how they can access other knowledge outside of their sort of immediate circle or immediate network. And that'll really help them gain access to new ideas faster and become aware of them more quickly.
Nice. I'm going to make a pitch for ASI as a multi-stakeholder organization with different types of knowledge. So accessing that is one thing. How we deploy that is another. There's a question actually come in from Justin as well, which is, can you say anything about the role of multipliers? He talks about trade associations, but I guess there's other enabling non-commercial entities in this environment. What role do they play?
Yeah, so in the same way, I think that policymakers, companies, startups, et cetera, can use this network thinking to understand how to reach the widest audience. For trade associations, I think many of them have a lot of very rich data on their membership, how they're kind of the relationships that they have, et cetera. So this kind of exercise of mapping those connections and trying to understand, if we want all of our members to kind of adopt a new sort of industry standard or get on board with sort of a regulation or a policy, et cetera, that's about to come in place. How do we kind of organically encourage these companies to kind of get on board faster and really see within our membership, within our kind of list of organizations that we work with, certainly there are ones that are probably more influential, almost providing signals to the others. So helping identify these kind of actors will potentially help the trade associations see, how we can engage in or kind of create more collaborations, potentially see how to spread ideas faster through that network. So they can almost use this thinking to see how to engage our member base more effectively, potentially.
So that's certainly true. As we develop our standards within ASI and look at the adoption of those, that's also critical as well, I think, is to look first of all at the impact of those standards, but also how we roll those out and drive change more broadly. So this kind of network systemic thinking is something that I think we're going to be looking at a lot more as well. Opens the question, what's more important, that kind of network approach or the innovation itself? Could you have a crap idea that actually flows through the system relatively well?
Right. No, there is a danger of that, I think, of course. So it could be that, there's sort of an innovation that might look great on paper, but then ends up causing more problems than expected. And, because of just the dynamics of the network, it just spreads quickly, of course. But I think, with innovations in general, there's a lot of research that look at sort of transition management, et cetera. So there's an entire stream of research that looks at how, if you think about technological development over time, it's not just a sort of light bulb that goes off and things transform from one day to the next. It's a very slow, gradual process of lots of different innovations that succeed and fail, and people learn from it and develop it further, et cetera. So in my view, with sort of transitions to sustainability or circular economy, I think the more innovations, the better, particularly ones that fail or cause problems, because at least that way you'll identify what those issues are and what kind of things we need to do to fix it. And that really is the sort of basis for the design thinking approach that I mentioned with the circular economy, to sort of see how we could create feedback loops and really learn from the failures and see what needs to be addressed.
Did your research, that then requires that you have kind of diversity of thinking as well, right? I mean, like you said before, if the same group of people thinking the same way, I guess it didn't take into account gendered roles within organizations and things as well, but that's, I guess, how can I put this? That's what needs to happen. Those kind of weak linkages needs to be brought to the fore if you're actually going to innovate. Can we do it that quickly? Is that happening fast enough for us to achieve circularity in the time frame required?
Yeah, I think surprisingly, I think with some of the dynamics with COVID and everything else, with remote work and things like that, I get the feeling that people now are more open to sort of jumping on a call or being more open to kind of connecting with others online, et cetera, and kind of just spreading ideas and sharing them. Whereas before, perhaps there was a limitation of like physically meeting and being present in a certain location. I think with the global economy as well, it's really kind of opened up access to information across geographies. and really enable the transfer of knowledge, etc. So in that sense, perhaps there is a sort of trend compared to maybe 20 or 30 years ago, where there is creation of more of these kind of ties and relationships to enable that exchange of information.
For those who have access to that platform to share ideas.
That is fair. Right. So I guess, yeah, indeed, with economies that don't have access to the internet, or where there's sort of limitations in that regard, perhaps it doesn't spread as quickly. But even that is changing. I think with the way technology is progressing, the sort of access to information is becoming more and more accessible to more and more people, which is great from an innovation perspective, because it gives people the opportunity to create new ideas, make people aware of these ideas, scale them, test them in the market, etc. So in that sense, making investments in those kinds, that kind of infrastructure is really key as well, to, as you said, form those connections and allow people to become aware of new thinking.
Great, we've reached that 45 minutes. So now all the questions are coming in. So we'll maybe do a couple more. Let's take a couple of minutes more time. I see one person has asked about the barriers to success of your networking approach, protection of business practices and business partners. Do you know what? I think they should ask you directly. I've shared your website with your networking tool. I think that's a great way in for them to ask you directly. Another question has come in the chat, which is, I think is interesting, about this, which sectors have the strongest networks and which the weakest ones, and whether the strength of the network correlates to the circularity. Maybe 30 seconds on that, and then we're done.
Sure. Yeah, there was actually a piece of research that I looked at that did an analysis actually of networks by different industries, the aerospace, automotive, construction, etc. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly which ones were strong and weak. And a lot of my model was more theoretical. So it kind of artificially constructed these networks, but happy to share that that research paper as well, along
Brilliant.
with the slides. And also I saw Mario asked if I could share the thesis. So happy to send a sort of PDF of that as well.
Fantastic. That was going to be my last question. So that's great. Some of the materials is in the Q&A, and then I think we'll share a big package on the website when this is going to be shared publicly too. So come back and watch at your leisure. With that, Shyaam, thanks very much for joining us today. It's really, time's flown by. Great subjects, and I think we're going to have more discussions on this as well. So it'd be great to have you come back again another time. There's certainly lots of questions come in. So thank you very much for joining us today, presenting your research, and thank you, the audience, for your questions and also for joining us today. There's more 45 minutes on coming in the next weeks, months, so join us again soon for another one. Thanks very much, Shyaam. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chris.